Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Millions of Americans are still trying to sort out the terrible tragedy at Virginia Tech University recently. With me today are two of my colleagues to talk about this terrible, terrible event. They are Dr. Doug Pruitt, psychology professor, and David Nickell, sociology professor. Welcome to the program. What about this, Doug, from a psychological point of view?
Well, I've watched, like everyone else has, some of the follow-up reports on this young man and some of the issues that were going on. And my guess is that this was a paranoid schizophrenic who had a psychotic break and really probably should have been diagnosed prior to this incident.
What is a paranoid schizophrenic?
Well, schizophrenia is probably the most disabling disorder that one can have psychologically, and it's a brain disorder. It's both present in the chemistry of the brain and the cellular structure of the brain, and leaves a person in a position where they oftentimes have hallucinations, delusions, and a lot of what Mr. Cho, I can't think of his last name, had expressed in some of his writings and actions would really indicate that he was delusional, being Moses, partying away for his people, etc. And it's a very disorganized way of thinking, false perceptions of reality, and resistant to any sort of logic or reasonable sorts of thoughts. So while most, the huge percentage of people that suffer the disorder never become violent, you just never know when one might.
Can it be treated with medication?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's very successfully treated with medication in most cases.
Well, is there evidence that he was being treated and didn't take his medicine?
Nothing that's been reported so far, just an incident where several years prior he had actually been picked up for stalking a couple of university students and was, the police actually placed him into a psychiatric care unit for a 2-day hold. And I think that's probably the one entry point that we would have had to perhaps diagnose and treat that disorder.
Mm-hmm. From the sociological perspective on this, I mean, this man had definite mental problems. There are mental problems in all societies, all times, and people get violent with them. I mean, we've got back through history, Jack the Ripper, lots of different cases of this. They're not always going out and doing mass murder at one point like this. And you've got to figure with increasing levels of population, you've got a percentage of the population suffers from these illnesses. You get more people, you're going to get a larger number of people with these kind of problems. So the question then gets to be whether or not you're getting more than you would anticipate from just an increase in population of people with these kind of problems. In this case, his family came here from South Korea, and he was evidently showing strong signs of this before they arrived in America even. So, I don't think you can say there are social causes for that kind of ailment. But then the question is, what does our society do with people with these kinds of problems? And what kind of mechanisms do we have for catching them, for treating them? How can they get along in society? To what extent can they get along in society? With schizophrenia, this is such a serious ailment that, there are all different levels of this, but to what extent can a person function without some kind of treatment? And to what extent are they just completely dysfunctional without treatment? And different kinds of societies treat these in different ways. One of the what-if questions that sociologists talk about a lot is what would happen to Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer in today's society? They would probably be in juvenile homes someplace or else medicated into compliance. We have a society today that doesn't leave room for that kind of alternate personalities, people that don't conform. And someone with this kind of mental condition, brain disorders, you say, because it is a chemical imbalance, isn't going to be able to conform to the norms of everyday society, and those are more rigidly defined today than before. And of course there's a whole range of issues there of why wasn't this guy called and treated. If we're not going to tolerate people not conforming to the norms of everyday society, expected behaviors, then what do we have to treat them so they can conform?
Mm-hmm. The Times of London, in an editorial, decried what it called the gun culture of America. Is this part of that? I mean, the fact that he was able to get a handgun so easily and commit this awful crime.
I think certainly that plays a role, that in a society such as ours, where there is the freedom to bear arms, to go out and purchase a gun at any given time, I think that we have to be certainly more restrictive in who can purchase that gun.
Well, I guess my question would be, how would a guy like this be able to purchase a gun? I mean,
well, what I understood from the laws in Virginia, that as long as you had not been convicted of a felony, that you pretty much have free access to go in and pick up a handgun, etc. And the only run-in with the law that this young man had in the past was a stalking issue at the university. And
well, that's what I was driving at. Here this fellow has already been apprehended for stalking.
Well, as I understand it, the woman did not press charges.
Neither
He
one.
was apprehended, and it was at that point that he was, they identified him as being a potential danger to society because of the mental issues, and he was put in for observation and then released pretty much under an agreement, as I understand it, that he was going to voluntarily seek treatment and things which he didn't follow up on. Mm-hmm. Now the question is, which is more dangerous with a handgun, a paranoid schizophrenic that's not getting treatment, or a convicted felon who's already done his time and is back out on the streets? Now, you got to look at this too, that it's not the presence or absence of guns that makes the difference. There are societies out there where there is many, or if not more, guns than what America has. I mean, Canada has as many guns around probably as Americans do, but their gun crime rate and violence is much lower than ours.
Now, why would that be?
It's part of our culture.
Shooting people?
Yes. I mean, just being a more violent society, and one of the things, human beings aren't born with it ingrained in your brain that you're supposed to behave this way, react these way to situations. The culture provides you with a script for how you should react to a situation. And we come from a frontier culture that just has a different attitude towards this. And one way to look at this, it's not the guns that cause the problem, it's Americans with guns that cause the problems. But that still doesn't answer the question in this case. This was an individual who was allowed to go buy a gun over the counter that had for a very long time been recognized as having very severe mental problems, had managed to slip through all the cracks. So he was never put in for treatment, was not under, as far as I know, any kind of medication or anything like this. He had been in several close scrapes with the law. And then you've got to weigh the issues of individual freedom and liberty versus the safety of the rest of society. And that's always a real touchy question of how do you balance those. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's, unfortunately, we usually don't have a very informed debate on those kinds of issues. Instead, we have a lot of rhetoric. People having reactions from ideological positions, but not actually looking at the real issue and figuring out how do we address this? Mm-hmm. How do you balance those?
This fella even sent photos to NBC about this. I mean,
in between events.
Right. I mean, how bizarre is that?
Well, given the nature of the disorder, it sounds crazy, but it makes perfect sense. that his attack was intended as a defense, more or less, or retribution for wrongs done, for harm that he somehow sustained. If anything, more than any other particular issue, the breakdown in communication is what concerns me so greatly. How do you have a student who's stalked people, who writes papers that are extremely disturbing, so much so that the professor says, I can't deal with this student, here, you deal with him, and the chair of the department deals with him and is afraid of him. He's been at least assessed by a mental institution. He's been in contact with the police department. Where is the breakdown in communication that says that we don't have some sort of identifying factor that says, this is not a person you sell a handgun to? It's a huge lack of communication, and I think it was evident almost when you first heard about this event and these writings that the young man had produced. The first response that I heard from a Virginia Tech employee was, we're not going to release those papers because of issues of privacy, personal privacy. Isn't that the issue in itself? We're so concerned about keeping private an issue of mental health that we're willing to let it go to the worst consequence possible. Mm-hmm. I think that goes right to the core of a society that's afraid to deal with psychological disorders. And the stigma isn't there anymore. It honestly is not there anymore, but these types of cases will bring it back in full force.
Mm-hmm. I'll read you some of this. This is quoting from what he sent to NBC News. You have vandalized my heart, raped my soul, and torched my conscience. You thought it was one pathetic boy's life you were extinguishing. Thanks to you, I die like Jesus Christ to inspire generations of the weak and the defenseless people. Do you know what it feels to be spit on your face and have trash shoved down your throat? Do you know what it feels like to dig your own grave? Do you know what it feels like to have your throat slashed from ear to ear? Do you know what it feels like to be torched alive? Do you know what it feels like to be humiliated and impaled upon a cross and left to bleed to death for your amusement? You have never felt a single ounce of pain your whole life. Do you want to inject as much misery in our lives as you can just because you can?
Delusional rantings. Where's the basis in reality? Where's the reference to what has been done that you're talking about? There is none, because it's purely it's delusional. And those types of rantings, those types of thoughts, those types of processes don't hold to logic. They don't make sense. So you don't deal with an individual like this by trying talk therapy, by saying, well, what are we talking about here, Joe? What do you mean by that? What are you referencing? Because you wouldn't get any sort of logical response to that. And that's why the disorder is mainly treated with medication, because it is definitely a brain disorder that it doesn't indicate anything was done wrong to this individual, mm-hmm. which is the sad part of it. It's just merely an internal conflict that's perceived out of nothing.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and this raises that issue again of to what extent do you tolerate people who have a different worldview, who think differently than the mainstream, and how do you know when to go and drag them back and say, we're not going to allow you to be that different anymore? And this again relates to the individual, to the larger society, and the kind of society we have now versus what we've had in the past and things. But one of the things that struck me when I saw the pictures of this was that he had posed for the mm-hmm. pictures. And he
One
was
with a pistol to his head. like this.
and he was dressed in a costume. Notice he had the gloves on. He knew what he was supposed to look like. There was an image there that was provided for him by the culture for how to flesh this out, how to react to these things. He wasn't born knowing to do this. The culture provides it for him. And it's done it through images, through the media, through our entertainment industry, through all of this. But the problem here is the overwhelming majority of people who use the video games, the movies, all these things that he'd been viewing are not affected that way by them. So, I mean, it's like Mark Twain said of censorship, it's like telling a man he can't eat meat because a baby can't chew it. Can't have a steak because a baby can't chew it. The vast majority of people are not affected anyway like this by those violent video games, violent movies, all this. I personally have never seen what anybody saw, how they saw that as entertainment, but it does not influence them that way. So do you ban those from society, keep those out of the hands of everybody because there are a few individuals out there that will be affected this way? Because it was his mental condition, the state of his brain chemistry and things that caused those images to affect him in that way.
And you had mentioned earlier, Doug, about him submitting papers that were obviously disturbed. Well, let's say you teach a class in science fiction writing. I mean, some of that stuff's pretty weird too.
Exactly.
And my wife, who teaches English in a high school, she has gotten some pretty off-the-wall stuff as well. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the product of a disturbed mind, but on the other hand, it could be. And I think that's very difficult to determine what's weird and what is psychotic.
I think you have to take more of a total picture of the individual, definitely. And given that obviously a professor of creative writing would see many examples of some things that some people would consider clearly odd, if not disturbed.
Well, you think
that
of
it was enough.
Think of Stephen King.
Stephen King.
How would you-
Yeah, it's like, what kind of a person is he?
Yeah.
I've
Absolutely.
often thought maybe he should have been locked up.
And wonder if he disturbed someone
Right.
along the way with
Or
his-
if he was
with his
disturbed to come up with those ideas.
Indeed. I think with this individual that there had to be more of a global picture of his behaviors, his attitudes, etc. You know, while the day-to-day average person isn't going to cross paths with someone like this and recognize something, certainly an expert would have an idea that something was going on. He was depicted as very quiet, but beyond very quiet. Non-responsive to others when they spoke to him or respond in one word.
Well, didn't you say that we were talking before the program that when he was young, they thought he couldn't talk?
Yeah, they thought there were serious problems there. Perhaps he was mute because even before his family came from Korea, evidently, he spoke so seldom to his parents that they thought there was something seriously wrong with him then. And there was already a problem. One of the indications how severe this was in his case, when you're dealing with college-age students, you're dealing with people that are making the transition out of adolescence. They're not quite adults yet. You're in a really strange formative time there. And this is when you find a lot of disorders like that, and a lot of people are going through strange transitions and a lot of strange thoughts, strange behaviors, all this manifesting itself. And yet this kid stood out. Enough so that one of his teachers even contacted the department chair and said, you either get this guy out of my class or I resign. And that's a pretty extreme response from a creative writing teacher who's going to be getting these kinds of writings from students all the time. I mean, this one really stood out, and that makes you wonder if this guy stood out that much. I saw an interview with some of his roommates from the dorms that were saying that they lived with him. Some of them had lived in this suite of rooms with him for 9 months and had never heard him speak. One of them had lived with him for 9 months, heard the name of the shooter, but didn't make the connection because he didn't really know who he was. It wasn't until they saw a picture that they realize that, oh wow, that was my roommate. That
But let's say you are this man's roommate. Aren't you kind of reluctant to turn him in because maybe he's just odd, maybe he's just quirky, but he's not crazy, and so you're turning him in as this insane person.
I think by social norms, yes, that would normally be the case. And in a college student, I wouldn't expect them to recognize that as a symptom of schizophrenia, which it is. A paucity of speech is a classic negative symptom of schizophrenia. So sure, we can't fault his roommates for not recognizing that there's something just totally off the wall about this kid. But for anyone who had a globalized picture of him, I think that there's enough clearly there to say, there's a red flag here. We need to do something along these lines. And I wonder about the system level response. We've come up with this new idea that students aren't students anymore. They're customers. They're consumers. And, well, we know the customer is always right. Mm-hmm. So what do you do in a situation like that when you're put in that position as a faculty member even?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to say that part of the problem with this too is we really can't define sanity.
That's true.
So what you're dealing
a
with
lot of
here
people
is
think we're crazy watching this show.
Well, right.
Several of my students do as well. And I'm not sure myself, but anyway.
So it is a question of extremes. I mean, at what point do you get manifested behavior that is so far outside of the norm? But everybody's a little odd. Everybody's got a little quirks. Everybody's, and okay, this guy's behaving differently. But for the average person, how do you know when this has crossed the line and become so far outside of the norm of behaviors that, and then what do you say? That he can't function on his own? Well, he's obviously doing that. He's making plans. He's making it through his classes. At what point do you know he's a danger to others?
He was a senior, wasn't he? A senior?
I don't remember.
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've all had students in our classes who come in, never say a word the entire semester, and just leave. And we think, well,
some of them very good students.
Some are excellent students. I've had some A students who did this. And you never knew. They performed extremely well on the test. They never got engaged in anything in class. So that's pretty tough.
Of course, you do have, you have certain indicators or guidelines that you're going to follow with any individual. Oddity in behavior, sure. How do we change a social norm? By being odd and getting others to follow along with us. But there's always that little fine line that says, when does that odd behavior become dangerous? Is it a threat? Is there anything threatening within this? And I think that's the line between just odd and outside of normal bounds of behavior. Certainly professionals that deal with diagnosing individuals with psychological disorders have guidelines to follow. They have criteria they must follow. And that's one, that the behavior's outside of social norms, but that alone isn't enough. Personal professional dysfunction is a second criteria. And subjective distress being another criteria. Well, hindsight's 20/20. We see all of that with this individual now. But could it have been diagnosed before? Should it have been diagnosed before? You're going to get varying opinions based on who saw him and when.
Well, going back to this professor who said, I want this guy out of my class, was he removed from the professor's class?
Yes.
He was.
Yes. And actually at that point, as I understand it, the department chair took the student in for one-on-one tutoring to get him through the course. And again, I don't know whether that was out of person.
It was an academic tutoring,
yes.
Or was it?
But it was during that time that the department chair decided he needed counseling.
Psychological counseling.
Yes, and arranged for him to go to the clinic for the counseling, which evidently he went once or twice but didn't follow through on, and you can't force him to do it. Part of the problem on this is there are a lot of people out there that are occasionally marginal on these kind of things. And you can't force them to go in, because here's that individual liberty versus, right? What do you do with this? A lot of people are only that way in transient cases, and then they kind of, the chemistry gets back in balance a little bit, and they, they can function again. Well, how do they know? They're just, I mean, they've got a lot of students they're dealing with. They're sending them there trying to get somebody to find out. He shows up there. This may have been the first time that clinician had ever seen him. He comes out in, he's behaving oddly, won't talk to them, but you don't know. I mean, there was nobody there really had the full picture. Everybody had pieces, which is part of the thing is we don't have the safety net in place to try to catch this kind of thing, much less all the other things of, okay, we've got somebody who's identified as having mental problems. Do we allow them to just go buy a gun over the counter? Do we allow them to keep taking classes with everybody else when the other students are afraid of them, which evidently they were in this case? I mean, this is one of those cases where we don't know the answers because we haven't figured out what the right questions are yet. And I think that's a lot of what the discussion needs to be right now is, what are the real questions we need to be asking on this? How do you go about framing the questions so we can begin to answer them? I mean, there's so many issues cross through this that...
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you suppose the upshot will be? Better screening on college campuses of students? I mean, what?
I don't know that you're going to see a lot happen in the academic arena. I think something that has to happen is when you have a case where there was at least one entry point, where legal issues became involved, where the person was placed under a hold for a certain period of time. You have to examine that and at least come up with a reasonable assessment period of time. Here in Kentucky, Paducah, Kentucky, let's say a person was considered of harm to themselves, potentially suicidal. We know that we're going to spend 72 hours with a hold, watching that person, assessing that person's behaviors, talking to them, getting some feel for where is this person at. Is it just themselves? Would they be of harm to others? And there are measures at that point in time when you indeed find a problem where that time period can be extended. Yes, in many jurisdictions that means a judge has to sign an order, but I saw on MSNBC a judge who indicated absolutely, if she were not convinced at that point in time, he would be there for an extended period of time until people were certain. And I think that's something that has been diluted based on the issues David's talking about, individual freedoms and rights, et cetera.
Our extended period of time can extend no further. We're out of time. Thank you all for being with us. My guests today were Dr. Doug Pruitt and David Nickell from our faculty. I'm Barry Craig, and we will see you next time.